So we kind of have like a YA Jurassic Park Da Vinci Code. Hi, my name is Adriana, and today I will be doing my reading wrap-up for the month of February. As per usual, I will start with my stats. I read a total of 5 books, 1 ebook, 2 audiobook, 1 paperback, and 1 hardback. I read a total of 1,187 pages with my eyeballs. I listened to 21 hours worth of audiobooks, and the average page length of my physical reads was 395.7 pages. I averaged a rating of 3.8, and I did not have any 5 stars this month, which is crazy. I give out 5 stars like candy, so kind of crazy that I did not have one this month. But I guess it was a short month, so maybe that had something to do with it? Maybe those extra 3 days would have given me time to finish 5-star. As for where I got these books from, 2 of them I already owned, 2 were from the library, and 1 was from the publisher. Alright, for a genre breakdown, I was not kidding last month when I said I am entering my reading every genre era, because I read 1 historical fiction, 1 literary fiction, 1 fantasy, 1 nonfiction, and 1 mystery thriller. So we're really just doing it all. We're doing it all this year. Before I get into the book-by-book reviews, please consider liking and commenting on this video and subscribing to my channel if you like bookish things. The first book I will talk about in this wrap-up is The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. I really enjoyed this book. It is a very slow-paced historical fiction about the fictional wife of Jesus. So it follows her life from her birth, basically, and following along her life and her rambunctious attitude about life, eventually meeting Jesus, falling in love, dealing with his crazy life that he brings upon himself and his family when he starts doing his religion things. It's very good and feels so real. All of these characters felt like just genuine people like you would meet. And I think that's sometimes can be kind of difficult in historical fiction, is making these people relatable and feel like real people. Because I mean, people have been the same for 10,000 years. We are all the same. We have the same amount of intelligence. We have the same, wants and dreams for our lives. We all just want to be happy, and I think this book did a really good job of making all of these historical figures feel like real people that you would meet. And I know I'm just like repeating myself, but they had humor amongst themselves it didn't feel modern, like it didn't feel like modern humor, but it felt appropriate for the time period we are reading. And it's just like, why wouldn't people be joking around and palling around with each other, 2,000 years ago? Like, of course they would. We all have friends. We all want to hang out and have fun with our friends and our family. So the fact that they're like palling around with each other or, dealing with the same kind of relationship issues we deal with today, like it just felt very real. But it is very slow paced. It is a very slow slice of life book. So that is why I ended up giving it, 4 stars instead of 5. It just excruciatingly slow at some parts. Speaking of slow, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Another very slow-paced book. My goal for last year was to read at least 1 Hemingway book. My plan was for it to be this Hemingway book, but it was not this one. I read The Old Man and the Sea, and I really enjoyed his writing style in The Old Man and the Sea. It's a very strange thing to try to explain as someone who is not like an English literary person, but he uses very short, clipped sentences, but they are very impactful. Like every sentence just feels so important and punchy, and I really liked that in The Old Man and the Sea because it's a very short novel. It is a very kind of whimsical whimsical. I don't know if whimsical is the right word, but it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like a real novel because it's just got like these crazy cerebral kind of dream sequences in it. And I just felt like that writing style fit that book very, very well. So I was a little bit nervous as to how that writing style would fit in an entire chunky narrative. And I was correct in my assumption that it was not going to work for me as well over a long form novel. I still really, really enjoyed this novel. I mean, there's a reason Hemingway is Hemingway and why we still talk about him to this day. He is a master of his craft, but just his writing style did not work as well for me in a long narrative form. So this book follows a fictional journalist. Nope, Hemingway was a real journalist. This book follows a fictional professor who decides to leave the United States and go fight for the communists, anti-fascist, Republicans, whatever you want to call them, the people fighting against the fascists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And this book really focuses on the themes of just war as a whole, how war affects all different types of people who choose to fight, people who don't choose to fight, people who get swept into fighting. It's also a love story, so our professor, Robert Jordan, falls in love with a young woman he meets while working with this guerrilla troop during the Spanish Civil War. And it's very insta-love. They fall in love over the course of like a day, and then they're talking about how they're just gonna be together forever. And knowing that the themes of this book are the consequences of war, you can probably guess how that ends. Spoiler alert, not well. It took me a long, long time to read this book, and I think you just kind of have to expect that. It is slow. It reads almost like a Socratic seminar at parts. You have these characters all discussing their own opinions on big ideas of war and Marxism and philosophies of life and not really coming to any sort of conclusions. You just get to hear the viewpoints of a couple different characters. We get a lot of long, drawn-out internal monologues from our main character, Robert Jordan. Specifically, the monologue at the very end of the book is definitely kind of the main theme of this book. This book feels like literature with like a capital L. And I am very glad I read it. I wouldn't say it was a particularly enjoyable experience. It cuts pretty deep. It's got a lot of not great ideas, just being from its time, about women, about how society is structured. I mean, Hemingway was pretty progressive for his time, but you know, he was still of his time. But I don't know, I think it's a really good anti-war novel. I don't know, I enjoyed it. Well, enjoyed is the wrong word. I am glad I read it, but now it's just gonna sit on my shelf and look important, because I probably won't read it again. The next book I listened to was The Lincoln Conspiracy. This is a nonfiction book about the first attempt upon Abraham Lincoln's life before even his inauguration to his first term. So when Lincoln was elected, there was a big conspiracy to assassinate him in Baltimore before he made it to DC for his inauguration, which I had never heard about this big plot. That's why the author wrote this book. It's not a very well, I mean, it's well documented. We have lots of documents about it, but I guess it's just not well taught. Like, we don't really hear about it. I guess in the greater context of Lincoln's presidency, there was a lot going on. So this one just kind of gets overlooked a little bit. I believe this author is also kind of a thriller adventure author. I haven't read any of his other works, but he does write fiction as well. And I thought this book read a lot like kind of an adventure thriller, which at parts. I mean, Parts of it read like a straight biography, but parts of it also kind of read in a more thrilling way, which I thought was really neat. I thought the pacing was really well put together. I would definitely recommend this book for anybody interested in American history. I'm a big history buff, not buff. I'm a big fan of history. I love learning all I can. So I really, really enjoyed this book. I got to learn, you know, all sorts of things about Lincoln that I didn't know before. I have a new appreciation for our 16th president. Is he 16th? Ooh, I got it. I remembered. Like, for example, he and all of his family lived in Illinois, and when they were leaving Illinois to go move into the White House, they couldn't bring the dog with them, so he set up a photo shoot of the dog so they could bring like professional pictures with them. And then, you know, the dog lived with the neighbors. But I just thought that was really cute and a very like humanizing moment for such a large figure in history. And I kind of wish that something that more biographies would do to really bring a large icon of, like, they're not even a person anymore. Like, some people get put up on such a pedestal, they don't feel like a person anymore. And Lincoln is one of those for me. So just hearing about how he set up a photo shoot for his dog so that they could have nice pictures to take with them to the White House just was very sweet, and I really enjoyed it. And, you know, hearing about Lincoln's self-deprecating sense of humor, how he was a goofy-looking guy, and I really appreciated it. You know, parts of it are a little bit scary. Again, I try not to get too political on this channel, but a lot of the rhetoric that was coming out of certain parts of the South about the president is not unfamiliar to some things you hear today. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. I really like this book. Like I said, I would definitely recommend it if you appreciate American history and want to learn more from an author who is very explicit about why the South was fighting the Civil War. He pulls no punches when it comes to saying that the Confederacy was in fact fighting for their perceived right to own human beings. So I appreciated that part too. It can always be a little sketchy when you're reading about this time in history and how diplomatic some authors tend to be about this whole states' rights thing when it comes to the Civil War. And I just thought this author did a good job of being front and center about what the Civil War was really about. So the next book I read was also an audiobook, and this was The Lost Witch. I actually originally had this as a NetGalley arc and I let it lapse, so I was going back and listening to it so that I could write a review of it for NetGalley, and I don't think that audiobook was the right route for me to go with this story. I just had a really hard time connecting to it as a whole. It is definitely a cozy fantasy type story. A witch from the 1920s through a magical debacle gets lost from her village and ends up popping up again in the same small Irish village 100 years later in 2022. All of the characters are very, very sweet, and all of their relationships are really, really fun to read about. But the actual action parts of the plot, it was just kind of striking like a weird middle ground to me where it wasn't low stakes enough to truly feel cozy fantasy, but it wasn't bombastic enough to keep me entertained. So I was having a really hard time bringing those things together and really feeling like every time I would kind of like sit back and just like enjoy the cozy atmosphere, all of a sudden there'd be like this crazy like monster popping out and trying to attack the villagers, but it would never really go anywhere. Like they would just kind of like zap it away. I don't know. I struggled with this book quite a bit, and I would like to go back and try to read it, you know, with my eyeballs and see if maybe I can connect to the story a little bit better that way. But I think it is a well-constructed story. It just didn't work for me. So if you are interested in you know, witchy, small town, Irish village, a little bit of a love story going on, I would recommend it. I think you should try it and maybe you'll have better luck than I did. And finally, the last book I read was The Bone Wars. This was another NetGalley arc and I ended up loving it a lot more than I ever should have. So I requested this book on NetGalley forever ago and I've been hanging on to this arc for like months and months and months and months and months. And it is coming out, I think in like mid-March. I will adjust as need be. And I had totally forgotten what it was about, but I think I requested it and was accepted for it right around the time I read Dragon Teeth last year, the Michael Crichton book on the Bone Wars, a historical fiction. So when I saw this, Bone Wars, I was like, ooh, good, more paleontology, like mid-1800s, wild, wild west, shenanigans. And it's not that at all. First of all, it is a YA book, which normally I'm not a big fan of YA. It is also contemporary, and so I was just wrong on all counts as to what to expect from this book. So this book follows a 16-year-old girl who wins this big fancy scholarship prize thing to be able to go be an intern on a paleontology dig hosted by like this grad student and some of her staff, and they find this super rare fossil that is really weird and it's not fitting into the correct genus of fossil. And then their dig gets raided by what they think is a government agency and turns out to be a shadowy cabal. And so they take this big trip to Europe to try to track down this fossil and figure out what's going on. So we kind of have like a YA Jurassic Park Da Vinci Code. And I loved it. I enjoyed it so much. It is ridiculous. Like, this book, I shouldn't like it on paper. So like the same way I should have really enjoyed The Lost Witch, I should not like this book, but I loved it. We've got a main character who is annoying, know-it-all, not like other girls, 16-year-old, right off the bat. That kind of irked me the whole time, but I was enjoying enough of what else was going on. We have a ridiculous Da Vinci Code-esque plot where none of the clues make any sense. We're finding all sorts of weird random hidden rooms with all sorts of weird pictogram things, which I have strayed away from the past couple years and have not enjoyed as much. So I have every reason to dislike this book, but I just love it. So, I don't know, maybe give it a try, even if it doesn't sound all that appealing to you. It's pretty short, it's zippy, it's fast-paced, it is the start of a series, so, you know, maybe give it a try. I was obsessed. So those are all 5 books I read in February. Somehow this video ended up just as long as the wrap-ups I do for when I read twice as many books. But you know, we're doing our best. I have lots of feelings about what I read this month. But thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video.